بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله مختار al-Mustafa, our great unlettered prophet al-Nabi al-Ummi, Muhammad bin Abdullah, who's also known as al-Muhannad, the sharpened sword. This is the history of the Muslim states, and it's going to cover both Islamic political and intellectual history. That means not only history of the different caliphates, dynasties, sultanates, kingdoms, etc., but also the developments in Islamic thought. How did fiqh develop? How did theology, aqidah, al-kalam, develop? How did Sunnis deal with the Mu'tazila or the Shia or the Khawarij? And how did we get to the modern period of colonization and resistance to that colonization? And my name is Hamza Ahmed Dudgeon. I'm a PhD student at Emory University in their Islamic Civilization Studies program. And it's basically Islamic studies, but they just call it Islamic Civilizations Studies to make it more broad. And we're going to talk about pre-Islamic Arabia, or the time period known as al-Jahiliyyah, because it's very influential for all of Islamic history. Because when the Arabs expand beyond Arabia during the time of the rightly guided caliphs, the first four caliphs, the Khulafa Rashidun, they inherit languages and cultures and histories of the Middle East that go very far back to ancient times. And the Arabs themselves are an ancient people that go back to prehistory. Before the written record, the Arabs existed. And they were there speaking their language and having their own cultures and religions. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, because especially religion in ancient Arabia had an impact on how Islam was understood and practiced, because they wanted to be different from the pagans, from the mushrikun, right? So we're going to talk about that, all that type of stuff. We're also going to talk about what this class is going to all be about, and what the assignments are going to look like, what's all on the syllabus. And we're going to talk a little bit about historiography, or how we do history. What are the methods of history? So we're going to read a little bit of Ibn Khaldun and discuss all of that. And of course, this is the first lecture in what will ultimately be a 12-lecture, 12-week class. Each week we'll have a pre-recorded lecture as well as a live session. And the live sessions are mainly there to discuss the readings and the reading responses, as well as the general assigned readings and the material covered in these pre-recorded lectures. أهلا وسهلا السلام عليكم يا طلاب العلم. So we're going to talk about the pre-Islamic times, al-Jahiliyyah. And, the main reason that we're going to talk about it is because it affects the rest of Islamic history quite heavily. In a traditional seerah book, biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you will find some mention of the pre-Islamic period, especially some of the basic Arab kingdoms, as well as some of the different tribes and their lineages, just to kind of help you understand the political landscape of 6th century Arabia. So that way you understand why certain people, especially enemies of Islam, acted the way they did. Why did Musaylama al-Kadhab and the other false prophets rise up during the Ridda Wars with Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu? Why did the Quraysh have this sense of superiority over the Muslims? Why did they feel so threatened by the Muslims? Why did Abraha attack the Kaaba, the year the Prophet ﷺ was born. Why did Persia send 2 agents to arrest the Prophet ﷺ? Why did they fight the Romans in Tabuk, Mu'tah, and Yarmouk? All of these things have to do with pre-Islamic history. And there are 4 main time periods that historians talk about. We have antiquity, meaning ancient times, late antiquity, which is a transitional period between ancient times and the medieval period, sometimes called the Hellenistic period. And then, after the medieval period, we have modernity. Now, modernity, some say it starts with the Enlightenment in Europe, or the Renaissance, with the Cartesian cogito, that is from René Descartes, where he said, cogito ergo sum in Latin, I think, therefore I am. Some say no, it starts with Kant, Immanuel Kant, with German idealism. And some say we live in an age of post-modernity, or post-structuralism, that is really said to have started in the late 60s, early 70s. This ultra-skeptical way of looking at the world pioneered by people like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, although I don't think Jacques Lacan is a postmodernist, but that's another story. Alain Badiou, although he is kind of old-school moralist. Slavoj Žižek, and others. But primarily people they think of like Roland Barthes, or maybe who else? All of them French post-structuralists, if you will. Whereas the medieval period is before all of the Western Enlightenment and goes back to, some say it starts with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Some say it starts later than that with the arrival of the Abbasid Caliphate, or the emergence of the Seljuk Turks and how they took over the Abbasid Caliphate. But regardless of all of the dating, exact dates that historians will debate about, those 4 categories have, you know, these rough time frames, and all historians know them and use these terms. And we will use those terms throughout this course, and this course will mostly focus on the medieval period. As you might have noticed this time here while I'm talking, we have these different images on this slide. On the left-hand side, we have figure 1, which is the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs for Arabs. All right. And usually when the ancient Egyptians would portray their enemies, they would be kneeling with their hands outstretched. Anyone they thought that was an enemy or somehow inferior, they would kind of look like this, like a vassal begging for something, trying to get a gift or trying to get some sort of protection or get something, right? Or they're bringing a gift, perhaps. They're bringing a tribute to their king, the king of Egypt, the pharaoh, a tribute because there is suzerainty. They have to pay a certain tax to Egypt. And in the middle on the top, we have an Assyrian relief. And that's in modern day Iraq and Syria and the greater Levant, showing an Arab woman who was captured with some camels there. And on the right hand side, we have cuneiform talking about Dilmun, or the Persian Gulf region, talking about Bahrain and Oman, and where the Qatar and United Arab Emirates are today. The Arabs that lived there are mentioned in ancient texts. And why are the Arabs mentioned by all these ancient civilizations? The Persians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Mesopotamians, Sumerians, and and Hittites and so on and so forth. Why? Because the Arabs lived amongst them all. The Arabs were the desert nomad Bedouins, and they traded with all of these people. The Arabs were often multilingual. They had their own Arabic language, but they might have spoken ancient Egyptian. They might have spoken Assyrian. They might have spoken Greek. They might have spoken Latin. Some of them were trained to speak Middle Persian or Pahlavi, and so on and so forth. And even one of them ascended to become the Emperor of Rome, Marcus Julius Philippus Arabs, who's in the middle there at the bottom. Arabs have been interacting with all of these civilizations since time immemorial. When did Arabs first appear with their own distinct language? Nobody really truly knows. But they've had their own distinct language that has grammatically remained fairly consistent for thousands of years, which is amazing. The word Arab, Musta'riba, Al-Arab Ariba, all of those things are found in ancient inscriptions in stone all over the Middle East. We know that Arabs existed. They left sentences, they left prayers in their language on stones all over the Middle East that bear their grammar, their names, their history, all of that. One could easily look at Professor Ahmed al-Jallad in Ohio, all of the work that he's done on Arabic inscription and ancient Arabic linguistics in the pre-Islamic times. And of course, the reading that you have for this week with Robert Hoyland, Arabia and the Arabs from the Bronze Age to the Coming of Islam, gives a fairly decent picture. And this is a history class. History classes require a lot of reading. You don't have to read everything in the book, but at least get the main ideas and arguments of the book. And we will proceed on explaining some things about ancient Arabia, some things about the class, the layout of the class, the syllabus, how the assignments will work, and we'll talk a little bit about Ibn Khaldun and historiography. So Dilmun, as it's known, or you might say the Persian Gulf or Eastern Arabia in ancient times, was of great importance to all the surrounding ancient empires. They were masters of the Persian Gulf. Arabia itself was known as the land in between Africa, Asia, and Europe. So ancient Arabs were guides at the crossroads of the world, if you will. And they had all kinds of trade routes that went through the Arabian desert. And Arabia extends all the way from Haran in southern Turkey down to Yemen and Oman. And so it's a huge geographical area. And it's a landmass that's larger than India or Europe. It's 1.5 million square miles. So it's a huge chunk of land, even though it's sparsely populated. And it comes from one large uniform block of ancient rock known as the Arabian Shield. And the topography of the land and a lot of the culture has remained unchanged for thousands of years. Of course, the biggest change was the advent of Islam, but as far as things that are mubah in the Islamic tradition, many of those cultural practices have remained unchanged since Sumerian times. Now, the Arabs were very famous for their frankincense and myrrh, as well as other types of aromatics. And these were highly valued because in pagan religion, they were used for ritual purposes, and later on with Christianity and Zoroastrianism as well. Excuse me. And quite frankly, they just smell good. I burn frankincense and myrrh quite often in my own home. Um, they also have psychedelic properties to them, so the smoke can induce a trance or some sort of spiritual state, which is probably why different religions over the millennia have used frankincense and myrrh. Um, they have antimicrobial properties, kind of like sage, and so on and so forth. But they were very highly valued. Even nowadays, it's kind of expensive stuff to buy, especially the quality stuff. And back then as well, it was, quite expensive. It was a huge trade commodity, and the Arabs held the monopoly over it, and so it was a way that they became quite wealthy, especially in Dilmun and southern Arabia, as we'll see soon. And the Arabs were known as military geniuses who had local knowledge. They are often hired by different empires to be guides or mercenaries, things like that. And amongst the Arabs themselves, they had a big diversity of cultures, religions, dialects. Some at different times they converted to Judaism, Christianity. They had different pagan gods amongst the different tribes, and lots of different diversity in that regard. Of course, their genetic makeup differs from place to place. Some of them are more mixed with Persian or with Roman, and other things like Assyrian and Egyptian and things like that. So, as we know, Arabs have a wide variety as to their facial features and skin color and hair texture and everything like that. So it's a very, diverse group of people. Some of them are original Arabs, al-Arab Ariba. Some of them are Musta'ariba, or they're Arabized Assyrians or some other ethnicity. And then, they've intermarried and all these different types of things. And so, it's quite the hodgepodge of culture. So that's something important to keep in mind. And then Dilmun, it goes back to different, being mentioned in the historical record as early as the 9th century BCE. They're mentioned in biblical and Assyrian cuneiform texts. And they were most active, or at least the historical record shows texts the most frequently between the 9th and 5th centuries BCE. Most of them are receipts from different, types of business transactions. And both the biblical and Assyrian sources actually use the word Arab with an ayin in those languages. So Arab is attested to as early as the 9th century BCE. Even probably before that, there are some ancient Persian references to Arabs. And because despite that these are different languages and they all mention Arab with an ayn, it's a strong evidence that this was the name that they used to call themselves. And it's also preserved in ancient Arabic inscriptions, the word Arab. So Arab is a very ancient word, and it's something that they've used to describe themselves since very ancient times. Now, southern Arabia, as you can see here, we have this documentary, Queen of Sheba. So Queen of Sheba is from southern Arabia, Bilqis as she is known in the Quran. And so southern Arabia, or South Arabia, it was the richest and most developed part of Arabia in antiquity. They had the most money because they had the most frankincense and myrrh. It grew naturally there. It also grows in the Horn of Africa, which they would have all access to that trade, being, just a short boat ride away. They spoke languages of non-Arabic origin. This is important. So you could see here this inscription, this tablet right here is not Arabic. It doesn't even look anything really like the Arabic script. And you could see the same language in the Queen of Sheba documentary thumbnail there. And this right here is a picture of the Marab Dam. So the Marab Dam is what funneled water through to the farmers with agriculture, right, with irrigation. So they spoke languages of non-Arabic origin. In fact, we really don't even know what language families they belong to. Many of the languages are undecipherable. There's very few extant inscriptions or epitaphs that survive. So we don't really know what their languages was like, but we know for sure that it was not Arabic. And some of their letters and writing is closer to ancient Ge'ez, or the pre-modern precursor to Amharic in Ethiopia. So some have wondered if it might be related to ancient Ge'ez, which might make it a Semitic language, but there's just not enough written evidence to discern that yet. So even to this day, that area remains very lush and green, like in southwest Saudi Arabia. It's mountainous but very lush and green, and Yemen is lusher and greener than other parts of Arabia to this day. But even in its heyday, they had a lot more agriculture because of the Marab Dam, and it's twice the length of the Hoover Dam, and it was first built in 1500 BCE. So this was something that existed a long time. Yemen had quite the civilization for quite a long time, but it had suffered a series of different collapses, and it would get repaired, but each time it collapsed, it wasn't repaired that good, or the dam would get smaller and weaker. And then finally it collapsed and was abandoned by Abraha being the one who attacked the Kaaba in Mecca, featured in Surah Al-Fil. And the Am al-Fil, the year of the elephant, it's debated by ulama, Islamic scholars, as well as Orientalists, when exactly it occurred. Some say it occurred around 550 CE. Some say maybe around 570. And so the collapse of the Marab Dam is dated in texts to right after the year of the elephant. So it could range anywhere between 550 and 575 CE. But around that time, the dam permanently collapsed. And when that happened, it created a huge amount of famine in the area. And tons of refugees left southern Arabia and settled in other parts of Arabia. So you have the companion Ammar bin Yasir radiyallahu anhu. His father Yasir was originally from Yemen and left because of famine. So his generation was part of this group who had to leave because of the collapse of the Marab Dam. But long before that, Sana'a, Mocha, Hadramaut, and Marab were the main cities of the region. So the Sabaean kingdom, or the kingdom of Saba, which is where the term Sheba comes from, it was based out of Marab, and so the Queen of Sheba is her temple is based in Marib, and that's where her power was based. Um, and they remained dominant until the 3rd century CE, Common Era. We don't know exactly when they started, but it's assumed that they kind of got started with the building of the Marib Dam in 1500 BCE. But anyways, we know that they remained dominant till the 3rd century Common Era. And then the Himyarite dynasty conquered all of southern Arabia, including the Sabaean kingdom, by the 5th century CE. So they kind of took over in the 3rd century and then completely dominated the region by the 5th century CE. And it was the first time that they unified all of southern Arabia into one polity, one political unit. Before that, you had different city-states, with Marib being the dominant one, but Sana'a, Mocha, Hadramaut, they each had their own governments. So this was the first time that all of them were ruled by the same people, the Himyarites. They would extend control or do raids as far away as El Yamama, modern-day Riyadh or Najd. And it was thought that they, for the most of their history, they were a Jewish theocracy, and this is talked about in, for instance, Sirah ibn Hisham. Details who the Himyariyyah are, and the different kings that they had that were Jewish. And they heavily persecuted this small Christian community in Najran. Najran is located in modern southwestern Saudi Arabia, and they slaughtered the Christians there in mass, which led the Aksumite kingdom, which was based in Abyssinia. That's where what the Negus was in charge of, and they were allied with the Romans because they were Christian, like the Romans, or the Byzantines rather. And so they, with the Roman approval and Roman help, they invaded southern Arabia, and this is where Abraha gets involved. So he was, kind of put in charge of the southern Arabia, and the Himyarite Jews, having been defeated by the Aksumites, they turned to Persia. Persia was the traditional ally of Jews, so they had some influence in Yathrib as well, where there were Jewish communities, and they came to the aid of the Jews in southern Arabia, killing Abraha. It said that an arrow was shot by the Persian commander, and it hit Abraha directly in the forehead, and the arrow exited through the base of the skull in the back by the neck of Abraha, and that's how he died. And it remained in Persian control basically up until the Islamic conquest, the Ridda Wars that happened under Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And so that's essentially southern Arabia in a nutshell. It's important to know the history of these kingdoms. Like I said, it's mentioned in Ibn Hisham, the oldest Sirah text available to us, as well as subsequent Sirah texts. They mention these pre-Islamic kingdoms because they shaped the political milieu of Arabia during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it determined a lot of tribal and regional politics, like during the Ridda Wars under Caliph Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu. And next is northern Arabia. So you have these three regions: Dilmun, southern Arabia, and then northern Arabia. Northern Arabia is really important. It focuses on the Nabateans and the Lakhmids. And the Nabateans, they're the ones in Petra. I'm sure you've all heard of Petra. And it was more of an arid climate. They didn't have as much agriculture and water or wealth as the other Arab kingdoms because they did not have a monopoly over frankincense and myrrh. They were more intermediaries in that trade and selling. They themselves would get it from southern Arabia and Dilmun and then go and sell it to the other empires, being the Roman Empire or Persian Empire or the Egyptians, so on and so forth, right? And they had influence over the Hijaz, the western part of Arabia, as well as Najd or Central Arabia. And they had, cultural and political influence in those regions. And they're known by different names. There's different groups: the Lahmids, Nabateans, that's Palmyrene, sorry for the typo, Palmyrenes, Hatrans, or Chersines. And those were different polities or political entities. And then they became suzerainties, or basically colonies of either the Romans or Persians. And Arabs in this region are documented as early as 853 BCE in an inscription about the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, who defeated a Gendibu or Gendibu, the Arab, in a battle in the Levant. So, like I said, Arabs are well documented in ancient times as having an important presence. And the Nabateans, who were ancestors of the Ghassanids, who show up, later in Islamic history, they ruled the southern Levant, like where modern-day Jordan is, from the 3rd century BCE until 106 current era. So they had a good 400 or 500 year run until it was conquered by the Roman Empire and annexed. And they were ruled by queens, females, and they worshipped the goddess al-Uzza, and al-Uzza was attended by priestesses. And notice grammatically the word al-Uzza is in the feminine form. And so it was a matriarchal society. And I want you to watch this documentary from the Smithsonian. It's called Sacred Sites, Season 1, Episode 1, which is on Petra. And it details the al-Uzza cult, which was based there. And it does a really good job of explaining Nabatean culture as a whole. And the Lahmids were based in al-Hira, which is in modern-day southern Iraq. And they are thought to have developed the Arabic script as we know it now, which was a derivative of the Assyrian script or Syriac script. So the Nabateans, they wrote all of their official government, business, and commerce receipts all in Syriac. So they're using the Syriac language and Syriac script, but it's known for a fact that they spoke Arabic in their everyday language. In fact, we have inscriptions that are written with the Syriac script, but completely Arabic grammar. And so we knew that Arabic was their actual native language. It's detailed by Dr. Ahmed al-Jallad's research. He's based in Ohio State University. And then in Hira, they kind of morphed the Syriac script into a script that worked better for Arabic. What we know as the Arabic script today is a derivative of the Syriac script. And I'm studying Syriac right now, and it's very similar to the Arabic script. And many of the words are almost identical, like Quran, they say Qiryana. So I mean, many of these words are pretty close because they're both Semitic languages, right? And Hira and the Lahmids, they were suzerainty of Persia. They originally were pagan, then converted to Christianity. They did kind of maintain their own independence for a good long time until the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where the Persians took direct control of them. Many of their elites studied Persian and were quite familiar with Persian culture. Whereas the Ghassanids, who are the descendants of the Nabateans, they would learn Greek, because that was the official language of the Byzantine Empire. And so we find inscriptions that have both Greek and Arabic in the Levant. And they were a suzerainty of the Byzantine Empire. And so you kind of have the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids fighting proxy wars, fighting against each other on behalf of Rome or behalf of Persia. So that's just something to keep in mind with Northern Arabia, is there's this kind of division between Iraq with the Lakhmids or Hira, and then with Sham having the Ghassanids of Petra, right? And you have all Arabs going all the way up to what's modern day Turkey during that time. So when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, before he received a revelation, when he was working the caravans for Khadija radiallahu anha, he would travel through Ghassanid territory up to Palmyra. And so this was a thing that was in the milieu that he would have encountered and would have known quite extensively about. And so, just to give you a rundown of what this class is going to look like, this is a history class. History, by its very nature, is a lot of reading. It's more reading than any other type of class you're going to take. So just right off the bat, this is a class that you're going to have to dedicate significant time to reading. So if you're not much of a reader, this class might not be for you, point blank. But not everybody loves reading as much as everybody else, and I understand that, and I want to be accommodating. So I also have some videos here and there that people can watch as like supplementary kind of bonus type material. But this class does require a lot of reading. And it doesn't always have to be close reading. You can be skimming the text. You can be looking at the table of contents. You can, just page through and until you find something interesting, and then you can focus on that and read more closely. It doesn't mean that everything you have to read super closely, but you have to be familiar with the basic narration, the basic story, the basic form, or the basic major events that occurred in that text. Just the idea is to get you familiar with a bunch of texts and expose you to a lot of different material. So just, be warned that this class, it is probably more reading than any of the other classes, in the other departments here at Mishkat University. And it's not to be scary. It's not to be difficult. Like I said, not everything you have to read closely. And mainly you'll be graded on the final research paper, which I want to talk about, as well as the weekly reading responses, quizzes, and final exam. So we can start with the weekly reading responses. So basically 8 of them are required. You may do all 11 of them, and then the highest top 8 grades are the ones that will be graded, right? So you can do all of them, or if there's one, you got something going on in life and it's really just too difficult, you could do 10 of them, 9 of them, but the minimum is to do 8, okay? And the idea is that you can pick and choose which topics or ideas are most interesting to you. Because not every part of the Khulafa Rashidun history is going to be equally interesting to each individual. So I want you, you all have different areas of specialization, different interests. I want to cater to your own personal interests with those reading responses. And essentially with the reading responses, I want you to have 2 pages, double spaced, and just focus on the key concepts in those readings. Compare, and it'll be usually two texts, so you'll compare and contrast different ideas in those texts, maybe the way they approach history, the way they approach this certain topic, maybe the different things that each author talks about. Why does one author omit this and the other author focuses on it? Things like that. I want you to engage, two different texts essentially, and use historiographical thinking. And we'll get into what historiography is here in a little bit. And use things from the other Islamic sciences, from fiqh, usul al-hadith, ulum al-Quran, all these different things that you're learning here at Mishkat University. Bring that into, that knowledge into these reading responses and show me what you know. But have a cogent, coherent argument, right? I want you to argue why one author is wrong or the other one's right, and things like that, right? And why maybe one author does something different than another, why somebody's wrong and why somebody's right, or what have you. And then there will be 2 quizzes, and the quizzes are really kind of the most basic fundamental information that you should be retaining from this course. They will be like basic events and dates, important things from the history that you should have memorized, and that after this course you should for sure remember. It's kind of like the basic knowledge from the time of the Khulafa Rashidun that you're going to need to know if you want to talk about, history in the period after that with the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates and the Shi'i century as it's known, and talking about Islamic Spain or the Mughal Empire in modern day India, or the Sokoto Caliphate in West Africa, the Ottoman Empire, Safavid Empire, and so on and so forth, right? It's just kind of the basic knowledge, the basic events that characterize Islamic civilization from then on out until the modern period right now. And then there will be a final exam, which it will be basically a big quiz with, like I said, the most important information that I expect you all to know by the end of this course. But really the most important part and the biggest percentage of your grade is going to be the final research paper. And I want you to use the Chicago citation style in the syllabus. There's a link that goes over the basics of Chicago style, which means you're going to be using footnotes. And you can just Google how to enter a footnote into Microsoft Word. It's extremely easy, actually. Or if you're using like Office Libre or any of those free types of Microsoft Words, they also all can do footnotes. Google Docs can do footnotes. It's very easy, so don't feel intimidated. But Chicago, it's also known as Turabian style, is the standard in the field of history. We don't, like MLA or APA citation styles are just not used in history at all. It would be extremely weird and unheard of, and you could never publish that way in a real academic article or anything like that. So if history is your passion and something you want to get into more deeper than just doing a bachelor's, or let's say you want to go do your master's or PhD and be a professor of Islamic history or something like that, I highly recommend that you learn the Chicago citation style, and then also Brill transliteration style for transliterating Arabic or Persian or like Urdu or various Islamic languages. If you know other languages other than English, such as Turkish or what have you, Brill is usually, their transliteration guide is pretty much the standard. You can also look at the Wikipedia page called the Romanization of Arabic. But I want you to use the Brill transliteration style for your reading responses and your final paper. And what I want you to do is look at primary sources, historical sources. That would be like Suyuti, Tabari, Najib Abadi. These are all the core texts if you see on the syllabus. And engage them with what Orientalists say. Which would be secondary literature. I want you to kind of look at how Orientalists do history and how it's like the opposite or very different than Islamic historians. And, I want you to argue against why a certain Orientalist is wrong on a certain topic. And so, all secondary sources, like the Orientalists, right, it has to be academic publishers, okay? Meaning like Yale University Press, One World Press, American University in Cairo Press, International Institute of Islamic Thought, IB Taurus, etc., etc. And just shoot me an email and ask me if you're unsure if a certain publisher or a certain book is an academic book. Because we don't want just like the commercial mass market history books that are non-academic in nature. They're full of all kinds of mistakes and problems. It's just like if someone cites a Wikipedia page in a paper, that's unacceptable. It's not a proper academic source. Anybody, literally anybody, can go and edit a Wikipedia page, and a lot of times I found mistakes on Wikipedia pages, or like crucial missing information. They're just terrible. I'll just put it that way. So I want your final papers to be 10 pages, double spaced, which is about 2,500 words. And I won't accept any papers that are longer than 15 pages because it's just too long. I have a lot of papers to grade. I don't have time to sit here and read all these papers. I got a family. I got another job besides this. I got a life. You all got a life. I got a life. Why not? Why waste each other's time, right? So I don't need you to write a big, huge, long paper. It's not going to get extra credit or nothing. Just 10 pages is great. You should be able to make your arguments in 10 pages or 2,500 words and no problem, right? And yeah, I guess that's essentially about it. If you have any more questions about this, please read the syllabus, check out the syllabus. Feel free to shoot me an email whenever you need. If you want to do like a one-on-one Zoom session, we can do that by appointment. But essentially, just to give you the rundown here, the weekly writing responses are going to be 30% of your grade. The final research paper will be 40% of your grade. The final exam will actually only be 20% of your grade. And attendance and participation will be 10% of your grade. Each discussion session, I want to hear you talk. I want to hear you say something about the reading, something you found interesting, or respond to one of the other students to make the discussion going. But I do expect that every discussion session, every single student participates. When I hear your voice and see you participating, that's when I'm going to check that you're present in the class. Otherwise, I will mark you as absent. So I do want, and it's got to be more than just a yes or I agree, say a sentence, ask a question, talk about something you read that you found interesting, because we're all going to be focusing on maybe different parts of the text because we're going to be doing a lot of reading, and maybe one person focused on this part of the reading, another person focused on this part of the reading, or part of this reading response or that reading response, and we all got different stuff to say. So, please participate in the discussions. That's real important to actually learning. When you talk about something that you've read, you remember it a lot better. So I want us to have some good, participation in the class discussions. So I want to talk a little bit about historical sources. So all the muhaddithin in our tradition, they wrote history books like Ibn Abdul Barr, Ibn Athir, Ibn Jawzi, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, Ibn Kathir, and so on and so on. List will go on for perpetuity, right? So it's an essential part of the Islamic sciences, right? Just like you have ilm al-hadith or ilm al-Quran or usul al-fiqh, furu' al-fiqh, all these different parts of the Islamic sciences. History is also part of the ulum ad-din, or part of the Islamic sciences. History impacts all the other Islamic sciences. To be the best practitioner that you can be of fiqh or ilm al-hadith or Quran or any of these things, you have to have a sound, grounded, firm knowledge of history. Okay? It's very important. It affects all the Islamic sciences, and I'll try to get into a little bit of how and why and all those things throughout this course. So just to start off with kind of the main history books in the Islamic tradition, we have Tariq al-Tabari, right? So you have Abu Ja'far Muhammad bin Jarir bin Yazid al-Tabari, who died in 923 Common Era or Current Era, and all the dates in this class will be by the Western Gregorian system, because frankly, we're in the West. This is in English. You know, I'm here in America, in Minnesota. That's what we know. That's our frame of reference. That's just easier, I think, for Westerners to deal with. But if you do want to add, you know, the 310 after Hijri, you want to add the Hijri date, you can do that in your papers. Just include the Gregorian date as well. And so in the top right corner there, you see them stack of green books. That's Tariq al-Tabari, fully translated into English. It's 40 volumes in English. And that'll be the main textbook of this course. Of course, we're not reading all 40 volumes because most of those actually have to do with the Umayyad and Abbasid period. And some of the volumes deal with history, pre-Islamic history, ancient history, Sirah, and things like that. So we're just focusing on the volumes that have to do with the Khulafa Rashidun. But, you know, Imam al-Tabari, he was a major scholar in our tradition. He had his own madhab, his own fiqh madhab that was called the Jariri madhab. So he was a faqih in his own right. He was a muhaddith in his own right. He has a book of hadith called Tahdhib al-Athar. And he has this really famous book called Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha, which goes into all the difference of opinion between all the different faqihs during his time. That's something that Sheikh Walid bin Idris al-Manisi at the Islamic University of Minnesota is currently teaching Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha lil-Tabari. And so yeah, Tabari, he's very famous in the Islamic sciences. You know, he even has his own Quran commentary. And after him, shortly thereafter, we had al-Mas'udi. Al-Mas'udi, part of it's been translated into English. It's part of your first reading if you've read that already, where he lists out all the different kind of books of history before him. And he's early in Islamic history relatively, you know, 345 after Hijrah, 956 current era. So, you know, even by his time, there had already been, you know, a ton of history books written. But he was Shi'i. That's also important to know. But his history books, kind of widely known, widely cited. Ibn Khaldun calls it sensationalist and accuses him of making all kinds of mistakes. We'll get into that a little more later. But that's al-Mas'udi. His book is called Muruj al-Dhahab wa Ma'adin al-Jawhar. Or the metals of gold and the mines of gems. So you could see that Burgundy book there is a translation, you know, partial translation of that text. And it's fully translated into French. They call it Les Prairies d'Or. So the prairies of gold, if you will. So if you know French and you want to engage that text, or you know Arabic and you want to engage, these are good texts to do for your final research paper. We have Ibn Khalikan, his famous book, Wafayat al-A'yan wa Anba Abna al-Zaman, which you can see here, the Dar al-Sadr edition, which is 8 volumes. That's a really famous history book. That covers like the history of the Tabi'een and Tabi'een, and after that. But it's untranslated. There's only partial translations of like little sections that I've seen. But for the most part, all the historical sources on Islamic history remain to this day in Arabic. The vast majority, overwhelming majority, are untranslated. So it's not something we would be able to use for this class. But if you know Arabic, you're more than welcome to read stuff or use it for your final paper. Same thing here with Ibn Khaldun, Abu Zayd Abdurrahman bin Muhammad bin Khaldun al-Hadrami. He was from Islamic Spain. Hadrami refers to Hadramaut. The Yemenis got around, let me tell you. But he was from Islamic Spain. He's known as the father of historiography, sociology, economics, and demography. So he was highly praised in the West during the Renaissance and during the early Enlightenment. The Europeans read him and knew about him and have been very fascinated by him, ever since. So he had a big impact on knowledge in the West, like especially sociology, economics, and history. So he's kind of like the father of the Western social sciences, if you will. And Ibn Khaldun, his reading is due also, so make sure you read that if you haven't already. If you have, then you know about the Muqaddimah. That's what I've been having you read for the assigned reading. And the Muqaddimah is just like the first volume of his history book, which is a multi-volume, long history book called al-Ibar. And, I highly recommend it if you ever, get fluent in Arabic, to go and try to read the whole book, or at least a good chunk of it, if you're into history that much. Next we have Ibn al-Imad al-Hanbali. He died in 1679, so this is almost 300 years after Ibn Khaldun, and he builds on all of Ibn Khaldun's work, all the previous historians' work, and that's the point here, is we all build on one another and add to the tradition, right? And so his book is called Shadrat al-Dhahab fi Akhbar min Dhahab. And I just love the name of this book. But Shadra, it means nugget. And Dhahab means gold. So here, the name of the book is Nuggets of Gold. I love that. Nuggets of Gold regarding reports from gold. Right? So I don't know. I just think that's like just a really cool title. And then one of the textbooks for this course, something that you can consult if you need to, but it's not something that I really assign much, is Akbar Shah Khan Najib Abadi. He died in 1938. And he's a traditional Islamic historian who builds upon all the previous historians. You'll see that a lot of what he writes matches up with Tabari actually pretty closely. He kind of like copies Tabari word for word in a lot of places, actually. So it's very sound, but he doesn't cite his sources according to modern Western standards, so that's kind of a little frustrating sometimes. But it's a decent book. It really is. And so that's, one of the books that we'll be using, and he's kind of like example of a more recent traditional Islamic historian right here. So, and then, these are formal kind of books of Islamic history, right? Or what you might call high history, if you will. But there's many other texts that give us historical information. A fiqh text, like a book of Fatawa, might mention the current political system or current social realia that we can get sources about. Maybe there's a fatwa about a deviant group and what they're doing, or a fatwa about the sultan, or something like that that can tell us some history. One example here is a book called al-Bukhala'u from al-Jahid al-Aynayn, and Bukhala means like stingy people. Bakhil is the singular. It means like someone who doesn't want to give up their money. They're stingy. They're kind of like Scrooge in the Western tradition, right? And they're a bunch of funny stories, but a lot of them are historically true stories. And so we can gather historical information about what life was like during the Abbasid period that Jahid found himself in. And Jahid, it's Jahid al-Aynayn is the longer, it's like his nickname, but longer name, Jahid for short. It means like the bulging of the two eyes. That was his nickname. He was apparently had bulging eyes, which is also a symptom of hypothyroidism. Maybe he had hypothyroidism. He was black, but lived in Baghdad, if I remember right. And during the Abbasid period, he was a Mu'tazili scholar of hadith and fiqh, and also very much into literature. A lot of the ulama who wrote all these traditional books on the Islamic sciences also wrote stories and literature and kind of fun stories that were morally edifying. And that's what al-Bukhala is about. So those are also sources of historical information for us as historians. And so now I want to talk a little bit about what is historiography. Um, Sorry here, it looks like my camera's kind of blocking some of these pictures I made for the slideshow, but you'll get the PDF of the slideshow or the PowerPoint document so you can see it in its original format. But what's historiography? Essentially, in summation, historiography is the theory of how to do history, right? Theory in Arabic is nazar. Sometimes they call it falsafa, philosophy, but what they really talk about is theory. Even in English, sometimes theory and philosophy can be used interchangeably. We're not talking about a theory, like a theorem, like theory of evolution or something like that. That's a theory in a different way of meaning. But historiography here, I copied this big paragraph here just from Wikipedia, even though I know Wikipedia is problematic, but as a professionally trained historian, this is fairly accurate. Historiography is the study of the methods of historians in developing history as an academic discipline. All right. And you might get into more niche topics like talking about historiography of Islamic political history, historiography of Islamic intellectual history, historiography of Islamic legal history, and so on and so forth. You get the idea, right? And so I wanted to talk about, in our contemporary time, who are the big experts in the world on historiography from the Islamic perspective and also from the Western secular perspective. And so up here is Sheikh William Chittick. Yeah, he's got a Western name, William Chittick, but he's a Muslim convert and a sheikh. And he studied extensively with traditional shuyukh, besides getting a PhD in Islamic history. And his biggest work on Islamic historiography, it's called Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul, the Pertinence of Islamic Cosmology in the Modern World, where he talks about how the modern world could really use an Islamic framework. And that framework can be applied to history and analyzing texts in a more broad sense. And then below here with the turban is the Moroccan professor and scholar Taha Abdurrahman. And Taha Abdurrahman, as far as I know, all of his stuff is untranslated. It's still in Arabic, but he's kind of one of the major Muslim historiographers that is alive in our current time. Very, very brilliant work. Him and William Chittick kind of more or less say a lot of the same things. They agree with each other quite a bit. And then in the Western tradition nowadays, this guy here who's kind of blocked by my camera is Leopold von Ranke, and he was German, and he was the father of Western historiography, if you will. He invented the method called historismus, which was historicity in English, or the Western historical critical method, which you'll read about towards the end of the class. We'll get into him. But he kind of developed like biblical criticism and making history to be like this critical science, that it's critical and academic, just like the hard sciences. That's what he was all about. And then you have Michel Foucault, who was a French theorist and historian. He wrote a lot about the history of the prison system in the West, the history of surveillance and punishment and insanity or craziness in the West and how it's been treated and hospitalized. The history of science and the history of Western knowledge, all of its different branches of knowledge, how it all came to be, how Western modern science developed, and how it became radically different from the Islamic tradition of science where it evolved out of during the Renaissance. So It's important to, be aware of these figures, even though we as Muslims might heavily disagree with them. We have to know what they're saying because it permeates international culture now. And I want to talk about Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddamah was part of the assigned reading for this week. So I just wanted to highlight a couple passages, give a little explanation. So for on the surface, history is no more than information about political events, dynasties, and occurrences of the remote past. Elegantly presented and spiced with proverbs, it serves to entertain large crowded gatherings and bring us to an understanding of human affairs. It shows how changing conditions affected human affairs, how certain dynasties came to occupy an ever wider space in the world, and how they settled the earth until they heard the call and their time was up, i.e. that civilization collapsed. And Ibn Khaldun goes on, the inner meaning of history, so on the surface you have history, then you have the inner meaning. And that in the Islamic civilization is the difference between zahir and batin, the apparent and the inner. So that the inner meaning of history, on the other hand, involves speculation, nadhr, and an attempt to get to the truth, subtle explanation of the causes and origins of existing things, and deep knowledge of how and why of events. History, therefore, is firmly rooted in philosophy, falsafa. It deserves to be accounted a branch of philosophy or theory. Like I said, they're kind of interchangeable. And then he goes on to say later on here, if he trusts historical information in its plain transmitted form and has no clear knowledge of the principles resulting from custom, the fundamental facts of politics, the nature of civilization, or the conditions governing human social organization, and if, furthermore, he does not evaluate remote or ancient material through comparison with near or contemporary material, he often cannot avoid stumbling and slipping and deviating from the high road of truth. Historians, Quran commentators, and leading transmitters have committed frequent errors in stories and events they reported. So people reporting in tafsir or, talking about a hadith, if they have their historical facts wrong, it may mess up their tafsir or their transmission of hadith. They did not check them with the principles underlying such historical situations. Right? They accepted them in the plain transmitted form without regard for its value. Nor did they compare them with similar material. Also, they did not probe more deeply with the yardstick of philosophy, with the help of knowledge of the nature of things, or with the help of speculation and historical insight. Therefore, they strayed from the truth and found themselves lost in the desert of baseless assumptions and errors. Essentially, what Ibn Khaldun is trying to say is that history is more than just narrating information. It's more than just a chronicle of events. As a historian, you have to think critically, think rationally to see if something's true or not. It's about more than the train of transmission, but taking the message that's being transmitted and analyzing it and saying, does this actually make sense given all the other information that I know? And so as a historian, we have to think more deeply and more critically than just this chain is sahih, therefore it must be true. Sure, this chain might be sahih, another narration might be sahih, and they contradict each other. Or you might have one narration that has a single sahih chain, another narration that has multiple chains. They're a little weaker, but which do you go with? How do you weigh that? There's all kinds of different reports from non-Muslims, reports from Muslims who are untrustworthy, reports from Muslims who are thiqat, they're trustworthy, and all these different things that we have to weigh. Basic knowledge about how geography works, about how climate works, about politics and how politics work, that can nullify a piece of information even if the chain is sahih. right? We have to be able to analyze and know what's going on, or you'll make grave errors, according to Ibn Khaldun. And we'll get into this more as we go along with the class, but that's basically the first lecture. I hope you found this all interesting. Sorry if I'm way too nerdy, but I love history, and I hope you could feel my passion, and I hope I can make you passionate about history as well. I pray that this is beneficial knowledge for all of us, that leads us to be closer with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.